historic occasion because we've managed to, through luck and sweat and changes in global politics, managed to get some very old friends and new associates, some of the people who kind of founded and fought for the early internet in Cuba, and some of the people who are making most creative use of it today, together on one panel. And since we have a wealth of panelists, our decision really was not to have everybody give a long formal paper, but to give a more short statement of kind of their analysis of what's going on, some of their own expertise, and have that as a way to open up a conversation among panelists and with the public. So the format of this panel will hopefully be different than what we've been experiencing, because it will be formed as kind of a discussion panel versus a presentation panel. My name is Ted Henkin, and I go by the alias occasionally as El Yuma. And that's partly in joke, but partly because Cubans don't use the word gringo, and only the Cuban government uses the word Yankee. The Cuban people tend to refer to their North American neighbors in friendly terms as Yumas. There's a long history to that term, and we can debate later. But I use that term to start my own blog and my own Twitter feed, and through that I actually have met a lot of other Cubans who are online writing blogs, and many of the people on this panel. So what I'm going to do now is just introduce who they are, and then I'll begin with a little bit of an overview of what I think is exciting, interesting, and happening in the world of Cuba 2.0, which is the title to this panel. So Larry Press is a professor at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and he has a long, illustrious career in information systems, but he's probably most well known to most of us, and we've seen his name in the press a lot lately because he also writes a blog called La Red Cubana, or the Internet in Cuba. And it's a great resource for someone who watches developments on of the Internet in Cuba very closely, and someone who benefits from a long history of more than 20 years of actually paying attention and engaging Cubans who work in that area. One of his old colleagues who we were able to invite from Cuba is Jesus Martinez. Jesus Martinez also has worked on the Internet in Cuba, but in Cuba in various state agencies for his whole career. He's currently the communications director at the Ministry of Transportation in Cuba. Oscar Viciedo, I met at a conference in Mexico a few years ago, and it turns out that he used to be Jesus's boss at the Senai. Is that how it's pronounced? Senai. He'll tell you more about that later, but they are old colleagues, work colleagues, and have a lot of experience, trying to give birth to and guide the early years of the Internet in Cuba. Oscar has been in the United States, living in the United States for the past 20 years, okay? Carlos Alberto Perez also has an alias. It's the name of his blog, and some people refer to him, some with love and some not with very much love, as La Chiringa de Cuba, the kite of Cuba. And on his blog, he does many things. The thing that has caused the most, I think he told me it started out as a joke, but it's a very serious joke, is he has this series that he has labeled, half-jokingly, Chiri Leaks. And he has actually leaked some very interesting and important information to the public that he really thinks the public needs to know about the Internet policy, the changing, dynamic, sometimes frustrating Internet policy of the Cuban government. He has he is an employee working with the Joven Club system in Cuba. It's a system of Internet and computer clubs throughout the island. He can give you more insight into what he does and some of his insights about the Internet and Cuban policy, and also what a lot of young people and not so young people are doing to pressure a greater openness, greater access to technology, especially information communications technology in Cuba. And the final panelist is Ellery Biddle. Ellery and I met a few years ago because we had a common friend and colleague in common, Elaine Diaz, who is a well-known Cuban blogger who is just about to launch a digital newspaper in Cuba called Periodismo del Barrio. Ellery is associated with Harvard University and with the Berkman Center at Harvard University that focuses on technology, communications, information technology. And she's also associated with a group of bloggers worldwide that basically advocate for and give exposure to bloggers in different countries who are often working in either technologically, politically, or economically disadvantaged circumstances, trying to reflect a broader array of voices, experiences, and analyses in the media in their various countries. And she has been focusing recently and intensely on Cuba and Cuban blogosphere and Cuban internet policy. So with that introduction, I'm going to read a couple things that will try to give a little bit of an idea about what I think are the most recent interesting developments going on in the world of Cuba internet. And then I'm going to specifically say a few words about one area that I've followed closely, which I kind of call beyond the blog. I've spent a lot of time focusing on the Cuban blogosphere and trying to map it, not quantitatively. Elaine Diaz has actually done some good quantitative research on mapping more than 2,000 different blogs. I've kind of looked qualitatively at the field and some of the leading blogs in different areas, and also traced the development of the blogosphere into something more than just a blogosphere, which is what I would call emergent independent digital media in Cuba. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Despite being one of the least connected countries in the Western Hemisphere, in recent years, Cuba has witnessed a veritable revolution in the creative use of a variety of new digital technologies to access, produce, share, distribute, archive, and commercialize digital data. Given recent Cuban government declarations about its intention to expand access to the internet, together with President Obama's new policy that explicitly allows U.S. telecom and internet companies to more easily provide communications equipment and services to Cubans, this panel convenes a group of analysts who will jointly discuss the emerging opportunities and continued challenges in the world of what we call Cuba 2.0. I'm going to start by sharing 2 or 3 little quotes here that some are recent, some are a little older, but they kind of set a nice tone and stage of the various kind of shoals that people who navigate the world of the internet in Cuba, either studying it or trying to use it to launch new media, gaming, entertainment, and in any other way, are kind of sailing through these different shoals or dangers. I want free access to information so I can form my own opinion. To elect the president by a direct vote, not another way. Ni militantes, ni disidentes, neither militants nor dissidents, all Cubans with the same rights. An end to the blockade and also the autobloqueo. Free the 5 heroes and, of course, free Maria. Quick question, does anybody know who the hell Maria is? Okay. Who's speaking? This is Robertico Carcassés, and this is a famous, now to some infamous quote that was sung during a protest in front of the U.S. interest section, now the U.S. Embassy, where he explicitly demands access to information so he can form his own opinion. Maria, of course, he's a jazz musician, marijuana, right? So he includes the legalization of that. Now for something completely different. Everyone knows why there's not more internet access in Cuba. Because it's costly. There are those who want to give it to us for free. However, that's not so the Cuban people can communicate, but instead with the purpose of penetrating us and carrying out an ideological campaign in order to achieve a new conquest. We must have internet, but in our own way, with full knowledge that it is an intention of imperialism to utilize it as another way of destroying the revolution. So this might be characterized as the Trojan horse understanding of the internet. And this is from Jose Ramon Machado Ventura, the second secretary of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, and one of the vice presidents, but not the first vice president anymore, of the Council of State. And this is just from 3 weeks ago. So I use those to kind of set two Cubans talking about the internet who are saying very different things, but are in some ways in conversations with one another. So what are some of the developments that have happened that I've been paying attention to and we may be incorporating in our discussion today? So there has been a production among the independent digital media in Cuba of a variety of projects that all seek to expand the public sphere in Cuba. We have this taking place after the development, let's say between 2007 and 2013, of what I've referred to before as the blogosphere, or a growing number of bloggers who are engaging public issues and debating with the public, with one another, and putting their opinions and analyses out there for the public to read and debate. This has been accompanied by and fueled a bit also by the opening by the Cuban government in 2013 of 118 internet cafes that has grown to 155, and then the latest number I saw was 300 internet cafes, but I haven't confirmed that. There's also, in 2014, the possibility of accessing one's email from a cell phone for the first time, provided that you use the interface, the Nauta interface in Cuba, which may not seem like very much to those of us living outside of Cuba, but is actually quite revolutionary in terms of the fact that Cubans often use internet as a way to get access, use the email as a kind of proxy for the internet, given that it allows them to get bulletins and other things sent via email to their inboxes so that they can get and share information in that way. There's also been a couple other phenomenons. One was mentioned in the last panel called the Paquete Semanal, the weekly packet, which is an island-wide digital distribution system that is monetized and is quite, is updated every week. That's why it's called the weekly packet, and contains everything from music videos to apps to magazines, newspapers, etc. And then finally, this was also mentioned in the last panel, there has been local Wi-Fi networks, not the 35 Wi-Fi networks that the government set up, but networks set up spontaneously by individuals who often use them for gaming, which is kind of the main purpose, but they connect together wirelessly with hundreds, sometimes even thousands of computers, sometimes repressed, sometimes tolerated by the government, but it also shows us the maker or the hacker culture among Cubans to find a way to do these things when there is no way. And then the thing that I'll end with, and then open up the discussion to the next person, is another development that was brought to my attention, and much of those people who pay attention to these issues, attention by Carlos Alberto Perez. We have, along with the opening of the 35 Wi-Fi spots that I just mentioned, there was also a government plan, the executive summary of which was leaked to the public, and is kind of a 5 or 25-year plan, depending on how you read it, of the plan of expanding internet access, the government's plan to the public in Cuba. And together with that was I think a 55-slide PowerPoint presentation that was also leaked by Carlos Alberto just a few weeks ago, that was very specific in rolling out for the first time in Cuba at a cost, meaning that it was pay per use to the public in Cuba of household internet access. So I can refer you to his blog for those things, but I say that these are a few of the many things that are happening in Cuba that I'm paying attention to. The one thing that I've been researching that we can talk about later if people are interested in, it is this world of the blogs that have gone beyond the blog to set up newspapers, digital newspapers. And there are a slew of them. And I'll just mention the names and then I'll pass the torch to our next speaker, who is Larry Press. Many people have mentioned 14 y Medio, but there is also Havana Times, Observatorio Crítico, Periodismo del Barrio, which I mentioned, which is going to be launching very soon, Elaine Diaz project. There's one that has to do with LGBT issues, Proyecto Arcoiris. La Joven Cuba is a blog that's been around 5 or 6 years. One of the founders and administrators of that blog is with us here at ASCII and is with us here today in the room. So we look forward to hearing from him in terms of comments and questions. Cubano Primer Plano, La Chiringa de Cuba, Cuba Posible, Convivencia, Estado de Sats. All of these projects have taken advantage of digital space, cyberspace, often because there aren't open, accessible public spaces, and because the mass media monopoly by the Communist Party doesn't permit the diversity of opinions to be reflected in the media. Together with this, there is what you might call a digital diaspora that has developed. And some of it's very old, going back as far as 20 years, but some of it is very new. Among this digital diaspora, I would start with On Cuba, which is actually very new. And it's hard to say whether that's part of the diaspora or not, because it's run by a Cuban American who spends most of his time in Havana, Hugo Cancio. But a very interesting publication that is actually also published and printed and put in many of the airplanes that fly tourists into Cuba. Progreso Semanal, Cuba Standard, Cuba Encuentro, Diario de Cuba, CubaNet, and Café Fuerte are some of the others, a number of which are run from Miami, some are run from Spain. So I'll stop there, and if people are interested, we can talk more about some of this. Larry?
Okay. Hi, Larry Press. I am going to, in keeping with kind of the theme of this, just kind of run down a little bit about the short and long-term future of the internet in Cuba. And this is, a lot of it will be speculative, but what the heck. And I've got a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them really fast, and they have pictures on them, not words. But they also have, you know how PowerPoints, they have accompanying notes and links and stuff. So if anybody wants to follow up on any of this stuff, I'd be happy to share the slides with you. And you can spend a lot more time with it. Follow the references. Okay, so here we go, short and long. I'll start with the short term and then go to the long term. The short term, a lot of what we know about the short term plans for the internet in Cuba is due to this guy down there at the end of the thing. As Ted mentioned, he's leaked a number of documents that he obviously can't tell you where he got them from, but he got them. And this is the plan, just the cover from the plan that Ted mentioned. And again, I have links to kind of analysis and as well as you can go to his stuff for other analysis, and you can see the documents themselves. So let me tell you what, I think I have 4 or 5 things that he has really leaked. One is that these 35 new hotspots, Wi-Fi access points, and I'm not sure if they're all 35 working now, but some of them are. That's known for sure. Okay, that's it. That's one of the things that has been leaked. Another thing is a plan to connect all universities by 2016 with fiber, and that's not to say. As I read that one, it seemed more like saying we will make fiber connections available to all the universities, not necessarily saying they will all accept the offer and connect up. But and I've shown there a couple of the universities that already are connected by fiber, not to say that those are the only ones. Next one, that all schools will be connected by 2018, starting with teachers now, and there's like a 3-year plan to roll out connections to all the schools. And to also provide computers. They talk about providing tablets. They don't say how much or to, whether it went to every kid or went to every school or whatever. We've talked, there's a lot of talk, Google goes there a lot. I've been urging them that it should be Chromebooks instead of tablets, but at any rate, the plan calls for connecting all schools, starting with teachers next year. Next. This is one, I think Ted mentioned this as well. There's a plan. The plan says that they will make DSL. DSL is do you guys know what DSL is? It's a form of connectivity. It's not dial-up. It's not what they mostly have today, the old dial-up modems. DSL is a persistent connection. It's considerably faster, and the plan is to make it available to 50% of Cuban homes by 2020. Again, that doesn't say to have all the Cuban homes connected by 2020. And I just popped a few question marks on this one. In order to have a DSL connection, you need a few things. One is the central office. There are about 600 and some Cuban central offices, central telephone offices. And in order to get a DSL connection, you have to have a decent phone line from your house to that central office. That's I don't have a pointer, but that's the lower question marks. And then the other question mark is the backhaul, the capacity of the feed from that central office back to the internet, and that's the question mark on the top. So I think there will be a lot of problems doing this, let's put it that way. And then the second question is how much will be the uptake if it is available, and that depends upon price. Prices were released in his WikiLeaks document. Oh no, ChiriLeaks, sorry. He's the Julian Assange of Cuba. But then Texas denied it, and they said, no, those prices were just placeholders for training. And I believe it, they were way too high. Okay, here's a fifth one I'm going to throw in. They could do this in the short run, but they're not going to do it. They could follow what the Indians and Bangladeshis did back early on to get cell phones started in their rural countries. They had people, microcredit women being cell phone call centers, basically, in villages. And Cuba could easily do that tomorrow using geostationary satellites, but I think there's no way they'll do it because it would mean communication to the internet which is out of control and can't be surveilled. But that goofy list of 200 occupations that's okay for that are authorized for self-employment. One of them is telecommunications agent or something. So you can imagine this happening, but I don't think it's going to. Anyhow, that is the short run. Let me make a few observations about the short run. I think I got 2 or 3 here. One is this. As of, about a month ago, nearly all of Cuba's international traffic is now over an undersea cable as opposed to satellite. And what that implies is that there's some kind of a backbone. If they're going to have, that little map I showed you of 35 provinces with 35 Wi-Fi hotspots in all the universities and all the schools, that implies a backbone, some kind of a high-speed backbone connecting the provinces of Cuba to the cable landing at the East End at Savannah Beach. And I have seen, and again, this isn't a WikiLeaks, it's a ChiriLeaks or anything. I can tell you I have seen 4 PowerPoint slides that purport to show a 4-phase phasing in of a fiber optic backbone. I'm sure today that it's a little fiber optic and a lot of wireless, but there seems to be, or if these slides are valid, there's a plan to build out the fiber optic backbone. Okay, second observation. China is the preferred vendor up to this point. China, those 3 things, they were installed in, and some people, and it seems that they may have made the loans to pay for the undersea cable. And now we get to Cherry Leaks. The one in the middle is Wi-Fi, and you see Huawei antennas there. And the one on the right is the home connectivity. And again, those little arrows are pointing to Huawei equipment installed in the central offices. So, yeah, China is got their foot in the door in the short run. Another observation, two more, having to do with quality and quantity. You should not confuse the kind of internet connectivity that they're talking about at a hotspot or in a home with what you've got in a developed nation. Here's the, in terms of quality, they're talking about, and they say this, and seeing believing, 1 megabit per second speed at the hotspots. They're saying the homes will be anywhere from 0.25 to 8 megabits per second. And again, that depends on the quality of the cabling and the distance between your house and the central office. There aren't going to be many at 8, and there aren't going to be a lot of people maybe that can afford it. And finally, they're saying 2 to 20 megabit connections in the universities. And to put that in perspective, just before I came down here, I fired up my cell phone and did a speed check, and just, you know, a cellular phone connection at my house is 21 megabits per second. So what we have in the United States or other developed nations speed-wise is nothing doing with what they're talking about in the short run in Cuba. And the same thing goes with quantity. There's been a lot of fuss made over these 35 Wi-Fi hotspots and maybe 600 navigation, and more power to them. But I used to live in Sweden, and I visited my old hometown about 2 weeks ago. And it's a town of 80,000 people. And I went to Google, Google Maps, and it turns out there are 21 hotels in this little town of 21,000 people. And they all have fast Wi-Fi in the rooms. So, you know, my little town, the hotels in Lund, Sweden, have a lot more Wi-Fi than Cuba's going to have at the end of this short-run plan. So again, it's you got to kind of keep it in that perspective. Okay, how about the long run? First of all, I don't know when the long run is. I put up on this slide 3 factors. The one on the left, the little red and blue thing, is, you know, what's going to be the outcome of political developments in the United States? Who's going to be president next time? There are some bills in Congress to nibble away at the embargo, particularly with respect to telecommunications. This Cuba Data Act has been introduced in both houses of our Congress. I don't know if that stuff goes anywhere or not, but that'll impact when the long run starts. The one on the right, obviously, it's the development of the Cuban economy. The faster it develops, the more thoroughly it develops, the sooner we'll see the long run begin. And then the little 2 quotes, I don't believe in words and slides, but I had to put these up. These are 2 quotes from 1997, when Cuba at that time had just come onto the internet. They'd had a kind of a pre-internet network before. They had just come onto the internet the year before. And these are 2 statements, 2 quotes from 2 Cuban leaders. You can read what they are. And you can guess also which view prevailed, was this kind of fear of the internet, fear of, what did the other guy, Valdez called it, the wild horse of the internet or something, the Mustang or something like that. But at any,
Wild colt.
The wild colt, okay. Anyhow, so really the question of when does the long run start has to do with, you know, when is Raul or whoever replaces him not afraid anymore of the internet? Or at least, can they feel they can control it and tolerate it? And Ellery's going to talk about that. She'll have something to say about that. Now, okay, how about the long run? Before I say the long run, I have to back up. I was able to take this picture yesterday, so I have to digress a little bit into not much. 1 minute, give me, you know, be nice to the old man. These 3 guys, what you see their name, Jesus, who's sitting up here, Juan in the audience, and Oscar. Okay, as I mentioned before, the internet came online in Cuba. I believe it was in September of '96. But before that, there was this pre-internet thing, which was called UUCP. I don't know, maybe some of you guys are familiar with it, but it was not the internet, but it was kind of like a distributed system of where you could do email and you could have discussion forums. And the guy that was the head of CENI, the institute that I think Ted mentioned, at the time that happened was Oscar. And the guy that took care of the fear that Raul later expressed was Juan. So we can really thank these guys. And Jesus is the youngster in this, but he was the head of CENI when Cuba actually did connect to the internet. By the way, to the United States National Science Foundation network. So it was a very different time. It was the internet community. It wasn't the political community. One last, this is a picture from when these guys, before the internet, when Oscar was the head of CENI, and you guys were getting the UUCP connection, and the little red arrow there is pointing at Jesus before he became the director. Okay, end of that digression. Now, how about the future, the long-run future? And I'll just say a few words about that. One thing is, excuse me, I just had a total cold. Cuba can skip technology generations. Cuba should skip technology generations. I'm saying they're kind of in, I don't know, the 90s or early 2000s technology today. But by the time they have the money and are over the fear and ready to do the long run, they will be able to do things, I won't say they'll do, but they can look at, and if I were running Cuba, I would be looking today at things like the proposals for low Earth orbit satellite constellations, that they're two very much active. The thing in the middle is fifth generation cellular technology. You saw before at my home I had, I forget, 21 megabits per second. What you're seeing there is a snapshot out of a video from Samsung. Their 5G tests. That's 1.2 billion bits per second in a car moving, 110 kilometers per hour. So the next generation of technology is going to make what I have at my home and you have at your home lame in many ways. And the right-hand one is just one more example. Google is doing experiments with high-speed local wireless, which could be, and you can see how much, it's the big yellow kind of a thing. You see how much faster that is than what we've got today with your Wi-Fi in your neighborhood and the kind of Wi-Fi networks that were talked about before. So the technology in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whenever Cuba has the money and is over the fear, will be very different. That being said, the interesting thing is not the technology. I say, if I were in Cuba, if I were running the show, I'd be running around looking at all these projects. But the policy is more important, really, than the technology. And monopolies are a bad thing. Monopolies are bad whether it's Atexa running the monopoly or whether it's AT&T running the monopoly. Trust me, I live in the United States. I have a choice of one internet service provider. It's their way or the highway. And it's not a good situation. So are there some alternatives to monopoly which Cuba should be looking at? And the answer is yes. There are things all over the place. So I'm going to run through a few of them. Stockholm, Sweden. Notice this slide starts in 1994. The city of Stockholm has been offering wholesale internet connectivity, wholesale infrastructure, think of it like sewers or something, throughout the city since 1994. And then on top of that, they invite competing internet service providers. And trust me, I would love to have the price and speed of internet connectivity in Stockholm. I put this one up because it's very well documented. Again, I have links to all this stuff in the PowerPoints. And if you go take a look at it, it's pretty compelling. So that's a model that they should be, and I'm going to put up, I think, 3 or 4, but there are plenty others that if I were running the show in Cuba, I'd be out talking to a lot of people. Singapore, the government is a venture capitalist. Singapore, the infrastructure is installed, the sort of wholesale infrastructure And then at the time I did this study, this was a few years ago. I don't know if I have no idea if there are more, but there were three competitive internet service providers on top of that wholesale infrastructure. But the difference between that and Stockholm is the Singapore government was an investor in all three of those retail operations. Singapore seems to have the government should get return for its investment, and they own shares. They're venture capitalists. What can I say? Here's here's municipal wholesale and retail. Here's a little. I picked this one because it's small and it's an okay example. It's a small town in Oregon with 10,000 people, and there are a lot of these kind of things in the U.S. And other countries. And here, the city is both the wholesaler of, they own the whole thing. They are a monopoly internet service provider, which I just said was a bad idea. But on the other hand, the thing that's important is local control. This SandyNet fiber is the directors, the control. It's under the control of the city council. And they are elected people. So if you've got local control, maybe you can only afford, you can't afford to have a bunch of competition. But these kind of things have been really successful. Again, I'd love to live in Sandy, Oregon, except for the rain and cold. Whatever. I think this is the last one I've got. Google put in a fiber backbone in Kampala in Uganda. And again, they own the backbone, but they're wholesalers, and there are a whole raft of competing retail internet service providers on top of that. Okay, another thing I would pay attention to if I were in Cuba is to look at what they've done in China and Vietnam. The internet has really, it's interesting. China and Cuba came online about the same time with way different attitudes. China let the internet proliferate. They encouraged it. They invested in it. But they also wanted to control it and surveil and, to control, access to materials. And Vietnam, I was in Vietnam. I was there, I don't know how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago. You got it. This guy. And at the time I was in Vietnam, all they had was what Oscar had put in Cuba 10 years earlier, which was UUCP, this kind of dial-up kind of network. I was back a couple of weeks ago. There's internet everywhere in Vietnam. It's all over. There's free Wi-Fi any place you can go. So if I were Cuba, I know it doesn't sound right to Americans, but I would also look at those models. Does this leave a role for ITEXA? Yeah, as an independently regulated wholesaler. I don't know if that's politically feasible. ITEXA, the ownership of ITEXA is murky. I know all the rumors. I don't know if there's any way to get to that, but if there's a will to do it, it would be a good thing to do. And I beat your minute. And again, this is me, Larry Press. That's my email address. If you'd like a copy of these slides, like I say, they're annotated and they have a lot of links in them. Feel free to send me an email. And I'll just I'll take now 30 seconds. Why don't you guys, are you going to put all these PowerPoints online somewhere?
We can, for sure,
Yeah, you should. I mean, I'd like to get some of the others that I've seen, and I'd happy to contribute mine. So he's the guy. He'll take care of that. Trust me. All right. Who's next?
Jesus?
Thank you very much. I speak Spanish, please. Y gracias, Ted. Gracias, Larry, todos por estar acá. Es difícil hablar después de Larry, ¿eh? No es la primera vez que me pasa, pero es difícil. Y de Antonio, que tocó una parte también en el panel anterior. Y ayer también se habló de conectividad. Entonces, en lo que me preparaba para venir, yo decía, bueno, ¿de qué voy a hablar? Porque yo estoy seguro que a mí siempre me toca al final también, es el otro problema. Que todo el mundo va a hablar lo mismo. Al final sería aburrido. Entonces, voy a hablar de números. Voy a hablar de números. De números, algo de nombre. porque sin número y sin nombre creo que no habría internet. Creo que es el principio. Y me van a disculpar también porque me va a costar un poco de trabajo, porque soy técnico, o sea, no soy economista, no soy periodista, no soy abogado. Y a veces a uno le cuesta trabajo hablar a un auditorio que no, para que me puedan entender. Verdaderamente, este tema de los números, y voy a ir después porque no quiero extenderme mucho, después hay otros compañeros que hablan y van a completar todo lo que estamos hablando acá. Es un problema apasionante, como les decía, por ahí empezó Internet, pero no voy a hablar de Internet, voy a hablar de Cuba. Y hice esta recopilación porque siempre tenemos que ir a ver un poco la historia de todo esto. Y Larry mostró, bueno, una foto ahí de hace muchos años, cuando éramos tan jóvenes. Y entonces, cuando aquello, inclusive Oscar era el director mío, y después me tocó a mí seguir con la batuta adelante, en momentos muy complicados para el país, que siempre ha estado enredado con problemas económicos. Bueno, ese fue el periodo más crítico de todo, sin dejar de serlo en estos momentos también. Pero este problema de las IP, para que tengan una idea, nada funciona si no tiene una IP. Una IP es una cantidad de números, son 32 bits, y esos 32 bits da una cantidad de direcciones IP. Esa cantidad de direcciones IP es la que nos permite conectar hoy cualquier tipo de equipo de tecnología que vayamos a utilizar. Y entonces, en la historia, lo van a ver después en otros gráficos, he marcado algunas cosas en rojo, algunas direcciones que quizás no se vean bien, como lo veía en mi computadora, se veía bien, pero en la década del 90, ya en el año 94, algunos se preocuparon por los nombres, que son muy importantes. Los nombres, vamos a descubrirlo, son los dominios. Los dominios son los nombres que tienen las páginas web y todas las aplicaciones que corren en Internet, porque es muy difícil memorizar un número. Entonces surgió esto de ponerle un nombre, que es más fácil, lo dice Cuba.cu, que si tuvieras que decir 190.34.7.8, es muy difícil eso, no es que lo memorice. Entonces por eso es que en Internet surgieron los nombres. Entonces hubo diferentes alternativas, porque hay una cosa que es verdad, y alguien decía en el panel anterior: primero, ser creativo, y lo otro, no se puede dejar de soñar. Y yo siempre digo, el día que yo deje de soñar, entonces ese día fue el día ya que estoy muerto. Siempre trato, ¿sí? Siempre trato de ponerme retos mayores, y verdaderamente muchos ya me lo han preguntado: ¿qué tú haces en Miami? Yo vivo en Cuba, vivo en La Habana, dirijo una red que la van a ver ahorita. También se las voy a presentar un poquito ahí por arriba, con un poco de gente que hace un poco de cosas realmente interesantes. Ahora, lo que quiero llevar a esto es cómo hemos visto todas estas asignaciones, estas solicitudes de direcciones IP en el tiempo. Y yo en otro momento tengo un gráfico también, porque la década del 90, a pesar de económicamente ser la más mala de todas, el BIP estaba muy por debajo del piso. Bueno, pues fue una década muy innovadora. Sin embargo, a partir del año 2000 se hicieron cosas mayores, pero la innovación en este campo, yo diría que disminuyó un poco. Así, fue una cosa así, si bien verdaderamente se hicieron cosas importantes. Pero a veces se hacen cosas importantes cuando no toca hacer esas cosas, porque son cosas que quedaron pendientes, que habían que hacer, y ya no se hicieron en el momento que había que hacerlo y se hacen ahora. Algo similar nos vuelve a pasar ahora. Entonces, el tema es el siguiente. El tema es que cuando yo pongo estas direcciones IP, fíjense cómo es ETEXA el predominante que tiene las direcciones IP, y cómo es algunos otros que tienen, organizaciones que tienen direcciones IP, pero que tienen menos direcciones IP. Y si ven, esto, al principio, de la gráfica y al final es donde más direcciones IP hay. O sea, eso es interesante porque ahí sucedieron dos cosas. Una, a veces también tenemos otro problema, que el análisis no se hace con un enfoque completamente sistémico, lo hacemos por una parte. Entonces, en aquel momento tenemos un solo proveedor, es ETEXA. Un día llegamos al principio que íbamos a tener 4, después se quedó ETEXA solo o dejaron solo ETEXA y las direcciones IP solicitadas al quien da las direcciones IP, que es un organismo internacional para la región. Por eso marqué las rojas, porque las rojas no eran de la región y en su momento fueron devueltas, se tuvieron que devolver. Entonces, no hay muchas direcciones IP. Sin embargo, ahora al final, sí aparecieron un poco más, se adquirieron por parte de ETEXA un poco más, pero siguen siendo insuficientes. Si ven en el gráfico anterior, el número daba que hay alrededor de un poquito más de 250,000 de direcciones IP. Si nosotros vamos a conectar todo lo que queremos conectar, es insuficiente. Hay mecanismos, por supuesto, que permiten trabajar con más direcciones IP, pero el problema está en que eso empieza a ser ineficiente para las redes, sea donde sea. Estoy hablando en cualquier lugar ahora, porque cuando tienes que hacer una traducción de una dirección que no sea real a una dirección real, entonces eso comienza a ser ineficiente. De hecho, aparentemente es seguro, pero no es seguro, es vulnerable también y te crea muchos problemas. Ayer o antier salió Windows 10, hace pocos días, ¿cierto? Windows 10. Y desde hace rato, ya desde Windows 7, ya trae incorporado nativo IP versión 6, una nueva generación de IP. Entonces, porque el problema está en que cuando vaya alguien ahora a pedir direcciones IP para conectar todo lo que queremos conectar y todo lo que habló Larry, le van a decir, no tengo dirección IP. Se acabaron. Y dice, ¿y qué hago? Dice, bueno, o no haces nada o cambias a otro tipo de dirección. Esas direcciones se llaman IP versión 6. Esa IP versión 6, algunos nos dimos cuenta de que ese era el futuro. Por eso cuando me decía, háblame del futuro, yo voy a hablar del futuro. No hay un país, no hay un proveedor de servicios que en los próximos años no pase a IP versión 6. Si no pasa, liquidó. No puede hacer nada de servicio. Porque aguantar 50 millones de equipos que van a haber en los próximos años a conectar a Internet, no hay direcciones IP. En la región de América Latina y el Caribe y en la región de Norteamérica, en este año se acaban las direcciones IP versión 4. Y eso implica un cambio totalmente de filosofía, porque fíjense, ahorita les decía, no por gusto, la IP versión 4, para que lo entiendan rápido, es de tamaño 32 bits. Bueno, el IP versión 6, 4 veces más. 128 bits. ¿Qué cantidad de direcciones hay? Con IP versión 4, 2 a la 32. ¿Cuántas direcciones hay con IP versión 6? 2 a la 128. Yo ese número no lo sé decir. Por eso le digo más fácil, 2 a la 128. O sea que, y eso lo toca todo, porque todo el tráfico que debe circular en la red cambia, las aplicaciones cambian. Pero el problema está en que ya los países y los grandes proveedores de aplicaciones ya hoy funcionan también con IP versión 6. Google ya funciona con IP versión 6. Casi todos los proveedores hoy funcionan, grandes de contenido, funcionan con IP versión 6. Y un buen día, porque hoy todo el mundo sigue ruteando los dos protocolos, va a pasar que ya no es eficiente rutear este, se queda este. Porque es el que va a durar por años. Y entonces ahí se complica, ya me queda todo, yo no he empezado todavía. Ese es el otro problema que yo tengo. El otro problema que tengo es que hablo mucho. Tengo que ir más rápido, entonces me disculpan el cuento, después lo vamos al pasillo. Ahora, a partir de los números, porque los números también nos dicen otra cosa. Las direcciones IP se agrupan en una cosa que se llama sistema autónomo y eso nos da los tráficos. Todos los países trabajan con sistemas autónomos. A cada red le toca un sistema autónomo. Puede tener uno, puede tener más de uno. Y eso lo hace más eficiente el funcionamiento de la red. Bueno, pues entonces, investigando un poco y abundando un poquito en lo que decía Larry en su presentación anterior, vimos que hoy, y reforzando lo del canal de fibra óptica, ayer discutíamos Larry y yo esto, la conexión de Cuba es de dos vías, o por satélite o por la fibra óptica submarina ALBA 1, que todos conocen. El satélite pone un retardo muy alto, 630, 300 milisegundos, de acuerdo al tipo de asimetría que tenga el canal que se compre. Sin embargo, ya con el otro, fíjense cómo ahí hay 3 proveedores. Está Telefónica, que está por el cable submarino. Está Tata Communications, que trabaja también por el cable submarino. Era la discusión mía con Larry ayer. Investigamos, y eso es fácil, porque a partir de la latencia del cable, de lo que da la conexión, ya sabemos por dónde va por un lado o por el otro. Y se mantiene Newcom. Y un poquito así, tiene Intelsat también de tráfico. Porque no se puede quitar el tráfico de satélite, porque el tráfico de satélite se contrata por años, porque es muy caro. Y entonces tú compras tráfico por satélite por 15 años, por 20 años, por 25 años. Si quieres romper el contrato, bueno, pues te multa. No puede ser. Entonces tienes que hoy echarte al hombro los dos costos, el del cable y el del satélite. Pero fíjense cómo también ya se ve tráfico IP versión 6. Tráfico IP versión 6. Entonces, nos dice que ya estamos moviendo tráfico. Yo tengo mi blog IP versión 6 también. O sea, hago cosas también. Nosotros hay mecanismos de transición. Cuando no lo estaban ruteando, nosotros lo hacíamos un túnel, usamos una de las tecnologías de transición y sacábamos tráfico IP versión 6 hace ya bastante tiempo. Y entonces, esto es interesante porque muestra cómo se mueve ese tráfico, cómo sale el tráfico hacia el mundo, tanto por cada uno de los canales de los proveedores de servicios que tiene hoy ETEXA, que tiene hoy Cuba, y salen al mundo entero. Ya me están 0 minutos. Y entonces ya yo tengo que seguir. Entonces, conclusiones. Adelanté las conclusiones. Tiene muchas ventajas IP versión 6. Obligado. Ahí tienes que pasar a IP versión 6. Se viene trabajando, haciendo algunas cosas. Nosotros también. Pero es estratégico. No solamente para Cuba, para todos los proveedores de servicios. Estratégico ir pasando IP versión 6. Por lo que le decía, la mayor cantidad de dispositivos que hay y todo esto. Miren, de aquí es muy fácil. Esta figura que me da el punto CU, que es el que lleva el control de todos los dominios, no se parece mucho a cuando trabajamos en la creación del punto CU hace, no sé, en el 98. No difiere mucho, no hemos crecido nada. Esto es un problema. Pero un problema que cuando se destape, que podamos crear más nombre de dominio, bueno, pues eso, pero está preparado, está la tecnología. Y de los contenidos no voy a hablar porque van a seguir hablando. Esa es la otra parte que le toca a ellos. Y entonces, esto es la red. Mire, muy fácil. Esa es la red que yo trabajo. Integramos las tecnologías. Y hoy en la red nosotros también tenemos tecnología GPRS. Tenemos un APN con la proveedora de celular. Y también tengo celular, no tengo Wi-Fi, pero tengo GPRS. Donde quiera que haya un móvil también tengo GPRS, tengo conectividad. O sea, es un poco que a veces haciendo uso de todas las tecnologías que a veces tenemos en las manos. Y eso es verdaderamente lo que estamos haciendo. Estas son mis conclusiones, se las dejo ahí, ni las voy a comentar porque más o menos lo he ido diciendo y ya terminé.
Bueno, ahora me toca a mí. Muy buenas tardes. Ante todo, quiero agradecer a ASCI por la invitación y por haber propiciado esta posibilidad de intervenir, de poder compartir la mesa acá con todos con tan distinguidos participantes. ante todo yo quisiera agradecer a Larry por todo el tiempo, más de 30 años, dedicado al estudio de Internet en Cuba. Yo creo que es un referente obligado actualmente, porque además tiene un punto de vista no isleño pero muy bien informado. Por lo tanto, yo recomiendo a todos ustedes que se refieran a él. Bueno, ante todo, yo creo que el título de la mesa, que era la Cuba 2.0, creo que es un título muy, muy conveniente. Eso nos expresa, espero que me quiera expresar, un hecho importante, como Cuba, o qué se puede entender por Cuba 2.0. Yo creo que en primer lugar, tal como yo lo interpreto, se refiere al hecho de entender de que hay una nación que desborda las fronteras de la isla, que hay una nación formada por una población en la isla y por una diáspora dispersa en el mundo, y que la tecnología, de una manera u otra, puede jugar un papel fundamental, y lo está jugando, en mi opinión, en cuanto a materializar y concretizar esa ciudadanía, digamos, más allá de la isla. Yo creo que lo que pasa es que el tema de Internet es muy complicado, en el sentido de que tiene muchos aspectos. Y yo creo que si ahí me dicen por qué es importante, en estos momentos yo creo que la nueva utopía en Cuba es Internet. Si ustedes ven y analizan los puntos de vista y los reclamos que se producen dentro de Cuba, hay una coincidencia casi unánime, independientemente de los puntos de vista, de la ideología y los posicionamientos políticos. Por ejemplo, Joanny hablaba de la isla de los desconectados. Esto fue un concepto que ella acuñó hace tiempo. Y no hace mucho, Milena Recio, una profesora de la Escuela Internacional de Periodismo, elaboró un interesante trabajo acerca de Internet en Cuba y le puso la hora de los desconectados. Es decir, que yo creo que primero parece que hay una coincidencia de que estamos desconectados, de que están desconectados. Y eso es algo que evidentemente es más que una percepción, es algo que en estos momentos crea un reclamo por parte de la población, por parte de la ciudadanía cubana, esté donde esté, en la necesidad de poner al país a la altura y en la necesidad del resto de los países. Y eso no es algo, y esto no es porque estemos condenados ni por el sistema político, ni por el nivel de desarrollo económico. Según un estudio que ha hecho Larry, en los años 90, principios 90, Cuba estaba a la cabeza del Caribe, en esa UCCP Network, estaba a la cabeza del Caribe y de algunos países de América Latina. Y había además un empeño de creatividad y de desarrollo a nivel de los núcleos más activos en el desarrollo de Internet de la época, según la observación de un especialista foráneo que en ese sentido podía ser. Es decir, que yo creo, y yo se planteó hoy aquí, ¿y por qué? Porque realmente, independientemente de los los multifactores que influyen en esto, en mi opinión es una cuestión de voluntad política, básicamente una cuestión de voluntad política. Yo cuando hace ya un tiempo, unos años, me hicieron una entrevista para el Miami Herald, Frances Robles, y ella me preguntó, bueno, ¿cuáles eran los problemas básicamente que usted enfrentó, tú enfrentaste cuando yo? Bueno, yo creo que tuvimos, yo no, fue un trabajo de equipo. Y thank you for the photo. Por esa foto del malecón, que para todo ese grupo que está ahí, independientemente de donde esté, representa mucho, nos representa mucho. Es muy emocionante para nosotros, es muy emocionante. Pero bueno, Y yo dije tres cosas. Y dije, bueno, tuvimos que enfrentarte tres dificultades. El embargo, o el bloqueo, como cada cual lo quiera llamar, eso era real, porque era el embargo, más el COCOM. No sé si ustedes saben lo que fue el COCOM. Nosotros éramos un país del campo socialista, inmersos en la Guerra Fría, y además estábamos sometidos a un serio, pero serio, restricción de carácter tecnológico, porque había intereses, hay que decirlo, militares incluso, detrás de todo esto. El otro factor fue, yo decía, era el estado de la tecnología y de las comunicaciones en ese momento, que han sido siempre descuidadas. Yo estaba leyendo el trabajo inicial que presentó Larris, y cuando lo estoy leyendo, mutatis mutandis, es decir, teniendo en cuenta los cambios que ha habido en el tiempo, estamos igual. Una base tecnológica, es decir, una base, se ha mejorado un poco, hay conexiones de fibra óptica, etcétera, etcétera, pero comparado con el resto del mundo, uno tiene que siempre compararse en términos de comparación, estamos igual, en una infraestructura realmente muy deficitaria. ¿Por qué? Porque no ha habido voluntad política realmente en el desarrollo de esta cuestión. Y no ha habido voluntad política por una cuestión de control. Eso me lleva a mí a plantear una cuestión, porque hablamos mucho de Internet en Cuba. Yo recuerdo que hace años tuve la oportunidad, ahí fue donde compartí también con... Oye, 5 minutos ya. Que yo soy gago y por eso me demoro un poco más. Y presenté una ponencia que se llamó Internet en Cuba. Eso fue en el año 95 en Georgetown University. Y entonces yo creo que me lo vuelvo a plantear. ¿Puede existir Internet en Cuba? La Internet no es, señores, no es simplemente interconectar computadoras. La Internet significa muchas cosas más. En el plano conceptual, en el plano económico, en el plano... la Internet es la eclosión de la descentralización. Es la sociedad descentralizada, casi anárquica, por definición. Cuba no se caracteriza exactamente por reflejar esa característica. Internet lo crearon anarquistas prácticamente anarquistas dentro de un proyecto del Departamento de Defensa. Y entonces, ahí hay un problema. Ahí hay un problema que no cuadra la caja con el billete, así como dice, no cuadra. Hay algo que no funciona. Y entonces, ahí hay una cuestión conceptual que habrá que resolver. De esos tres defectos, el otro problema que planteé, el tercero, fue la omnipresente seguridad del Estado. Y no porque la seguridad del Estado fuera mala, porque la seguridad del Estado hacía su trabajo. Era el representante de toda una filosofía y todo un Estado, porque hoy día a veces yo veo que le echan la culpa de todo de Texas, incluso en Cuba yo creo que Texas es el policía malo, le toca, Texas, además Texas tendrá que generar una cantidad de ingresos al erario nacional, y yo no creo que en Texas yo tengo muchos compañeros que nos conocimos en esa época que están en Texas y son gente muy creativa igual, que son gente que quieren, están preocupados, deseosos, pero bueno, yo creo que es peligroso también Texas la mala, pero Texas no, Texas además tiene gran defecto que la autolimita de ser un monopolio, totalmente de acuerdo. El monopolio es totalmente un problemita que hay que resolver. Por último, en esta cuestión, en la época aquella inicial nuestra, nosotros fuimos los primeros que comercializamos servicios de correo electrónico y de acceso a bancos de datos y de información electrónica en Cuba. Parecía loco, ¿no? Parecíamos locos. Nosotros nos decían locos, comunicaciones nos decían locos, todo el mundo nos decía locos, y éramos tremendos hackers. ¿Quién dijo por ahí que los cubanos eran mejores hackers? Así es. Nosotros, de cierta manera, éramos hackers en el sentido de que no hackeábamos un cable, hackeamos el sistema completo, hackeamos el sistema del Ministerio de Comunicaciones en aquella época, que era un monopolio establecido, y logramos, a través de determinados vericuetos de apoyos y coyunturas, no que éramos tampoco supermanes, pero logramos hackearlo en ese sentido. Y entonces hay un aspecto que es importante, y es que nosotros creamos una figura comercial para poder funcionar, porque los soviéticos nos empezaron a cobrar el canal que teníamos para X25 en dólares, etcétera, etcétera. Y había que buscar dólares. Ahí fue el momento que cambiamos la bandera roja por la verde. ¿Está claro? Y entonces a buscar dólares para seguir funcionando, para seguir desarrollando lo que nosotros estábamos haciendo. Y entonces creamos un eslogan que decía: nuestra oferta, competitividad. Eso lo mencionó un artículo de esa época, Larry, que le llamó mucho la atención, que decía que nosotros éramos un grupo muy raro, que transpirábamos un estilo muy empresarial y que disfrutábamos desmontando el monopolio de las comunicaciones. Y yo creo que precisamente el gran problema, y esto creo que me estoy repitiendo porque se ha hablado tanto de esto, y yo creo que tiene que ver mucho con todo esto que se ha hablado acá, es que no hay sociedad. ¿Y eso qué significa? Hacer. No hay sociedad que pueda ser competitiva sin el alcance y el uso de esta tecnología. Muchas gracias a todos, y se me acabó lo que se daba.
Now we're going to hear from Carlos Alberto Pérez, que también va a hablar en español, pero despacio.
Wow. Tarea difícil. Hablar suave para los cubanos es una tarea difícil. Bueno, mi nombre es Carlos Alberto. Dirijo la revista de computación electrónica de Cuba, de los Joven Club. Pero bueno, ese es mi trabajo como parte de un ciudadano más que trabaja para el gobierno cubano. Realmente lo que me apasiona a mí es mi blog, La Chiringa de Cuba, y en el cual he estado compartiendo, polemizando, debatiendo los últimos 5 años, como digamos un mecanismo de participación, desde el momento en que me di cuenta de que los jóvenes cubanos no teníamos espacio para la participación y que no había otra mejor manera que tomar o hacerse del espacio de las redes para escribir, polemizar y hacer un trabajo diferente a lo que hacía Granma y Juventud Rebelde. Y bueno, pues entonces allá salió La Chiringa, empezar a escribir sobre lo que yo hablaba con mis amigos en la guagua o en la esquina, o lo que escuchaba en la cola del pan. Entonces yo creo que, bueno, también en esta época surgen diferentes tipos de blogs. La blogosfera en aquel momento era prácticamente desconocida. Y en estos últimos 5 años se han ido sumando muchísimos nuevos profiles, ¿no? Es decir, está dividida además, están los ultraizquierdas, que son los que defienden a capa y espada la revolución, y los que cogen el artículo de Granma y lo republican en su blog. Está la ultraderecha, que bueno, son los disidentes, que realmente tienen unos puntos de vista muy diferentes. Y bueno, también hay me dijeron en Madrid hace poco que yo pertenecía a una zona gris, algo así le llaman, que es que no eres disidente, pero no dejas de ser crítico. No sé cómo realmente sería, pero realmente no soy disidente y sí soy muy crítico. Yo creo que a Cuba le hace falta mucho la crítica, y me parece que hace falta construir sobre el espacio de la crítica, que falta totalmente de los medios. Y entonces los hemos convertido, tanto blogueros disidentes como ultraizquierdistas o como centristas o grises, en una referencia internacional, debido a lo que sucede en Cuba, lo que no sucede en ningún lugar del mundo. Es decir, en Cuba la prensa está controlada por los medios, está controlada por el partido. No se puede decir más allá de lo que se debe decir o de lo que viene en un paquete. Y entonces el que quiere informarse sobre Cuba indiscutiblemente tiene que ir a la blogosfera. Es decir, si realmente quieres informarte sobre Cuba, podrás leer Diario de Cuba o Radio Martí o el Nuevo Herald, pero tendrás que leer Cuba Debate y Granma, pero tendrás que leerte indiscutiblemente la blogosfera. Es decir, la opinión del cubano de a pie, el sentir de verdad, ni de un a la derecha ni de un a la izquierda, está en esa blogosfera que somos nosotros. Yo cojo 6 guaguas diarias, 3 para ir a mi trabajo y 3 para regresar, y gano $20 al mes. Entonces, aquí en Miami soy comunista, en La Habana soy disidente, pagado por la extrema derecha de Miami, entonces es muy difícil, sí, estoy como flotando, es muy difícil estar en ese medio, pero realmente no me importa. Yo soy lo que la gente quiera que yo sea, mientras me dejen decir lo que quiero decir, cuando lo quiero decir y como lo quiero decir. Entonces, eso lo dije rápido, Ted. Sí, eso lo dije rápido. Entonces, yo creo que la labor es esa. Yo creo que la juventud cubana está llamada a esto. Creo que hacía mucha falta tomar el espacio y reflexionar sobre la Internet. Hemos logrado muchas cosas. Es decir, en esta batalla hemos logrado que el gobierno cubano nos escuche. Tengo 3 ejemplos muy claros. Cuando primera vez anunciaron la noticia de que Internet estaba en Cuba y de que habían 200 puntos en todo el país, nos llamaron al Ministerio de Comunicaciones, a mi celular pronto. Oh, Carlos Alberto, usted pudiera venir al Ministerio de las Comunicaciones. Así hicieron con 10 o 12 más. Sí, según ellos fue los que más críticamente habíamos tratado el tema de la Internet, de que por qué en Cuba no hay Internet, Internet para Cuba, Internet es un derecho y nosotros queremos Internet. Y sencillamente nos llamaron como que a rendirnos cuenta ese día. Nunca había antes sucedido. Nos reunimos con un viceministro, con el viceministro de Comunicaciones. Nos citaron a las 2 de la tarde y la conferencia oficial de prensa con medios nacionales y extranjeros fue 1 hora después, a las 3 de la tarde. En alguna medida tuvimos la exclusiva. En la conferencia de prensa de las 3 de la tarde con la prensa no estaba el viceministro, estaba el presidente de TELSA. Es decir, eso como quiera que sea un logro. Paquito, profesor de la Universidad de La Habana, bloguero y defensor de los derechos de la comunidad gay, fue consultado por el canciller cubano cuando cuando vino aquí a Estados Unidos, a la ONU, a tomar una decisión que tenía que ver con la comunidad gay. Y fue consultado precisamente por sus conocimientos y por lo que sabía. Y bueno, el año pasado, antes pasado, me voy a citar yo mismo, publico, filtro algo concerniente con los exámenes de ingreso que sabían que estaban en la calle. Y bueno, yo lo llamé al Ministerio de Educación, fui allí, me dijeron que no, que eso era una patraña del imperialismo para desacreditar la revolución cubana, no sé qué. Y le dije, pero es que yo tengo los exámenes que ustedes van a aplicar en 3 días, yo los tengo en la mano. No los apliquen, cámbienlos. Es injusto. Y los aplicaron. Y entonces al otro día salgo yo y les publico los exámenes. Es una cosa que ella muy lacrada, muy sellada, con tremenda custodia y que no hay forma de que nadie acceda con una cámara a hacerle una foto. Yo les publico los exámenes y les dije, se los dije, están aquí. Claro, el titular del Nuevo Herald el otro día fue: bloguero cubano denuncia fraude masivo en la educación cubana. Aquello fue una bomba, no les puedo explicar qué fue lo que pasó después. No sería ético, pero al final lograron cambiar, es decir, lograron reaplicar el examen de ingreso. Es decir, eso es un logro de las redes. Recientemente acabo de publicar los Chirilic. Me ha dado por eso, le puse jocosamente ese nombre. Pero son informaciones muy reales y muy fuertes que me llegan, porque bueno, tengo muchas amistades, muchas fuentes me han identificado como sí, una persona que puede y que tiene valor para publicar esas cosas. Y yo le decía a Ted y a Larry ahorita, Texas saca una respuesta. Al final tienen tanta presión, se sienten tan presionados que no saben lo que van a hacer. Es decir, evidentemente, si antes los medios han sido históricamente controlados por el partido, las redes no las pueden controlar, no saben qué es lo que van a hacer. Es la importancia que ahora mismo le estamos viendo, incluso para el desarrollo económico del país. Están viendo Internet como un sitio donde se pueden leer cosas malas de Cuba, donde la contrarrevolución puede hacer esto, donde alguien puede hacer una crítica. Sin embargo, no están viendo Internet como un lugar donde se puede hacer gobierno electrónico o donde se puede hacer comercio electrónico, que es lo que ustedes viven a diario aquí en este país y bueno, en todos los países del mundo. Es algo tan natural como eso que sencillamente no son capaces de asumirlo. Y han cometido muchos errores. Han cometido muchos errores. ¿Cuánto me queda? Han cometido muchos errores, como por ejemplo cuando se precipitan, precisamente por la presión, a poner el teléfono, el correo nauta en los teléfonos de los ciudadanos cubanos. Sí, se precipitan por la presión y se dan cuenta a los 2 meses de que los servidores colapsan. Si no tenían la tecnología necesaria para hacerlo. Ese es un error de ellos. El otro error es que bueno, tanta presión logran poner internet por todo el país, pero la ponen a $4.50 CUC, la hora. Fue una bomba aquello. Ahora la ponen a 2, sigue siendo una bomba. Es decir, es como si no salieran del subdesarrollo. Y entonces la presión política que se está haciendo en las redes en cuanto a este tema y en cuanto a muchísimo, los precios de los carros, la ley es decir, los abusos de la aduana, la ley de migración, son muchísimas cosas que al final tenemos que agradecerle a las redes, a la gente que estamos día a día, seamos disidentes, no disidentes, comunistas, revolucionarios, lo que sea, pero que sí estamos tratando de llevar el país hacia un camino y de decir, está bien, si la educación y la salud está muy bien en Cuba, perfecto, pero si te equivocas aquí o te equivocas allá, te lo voy a decir igual y te voy a presionar. Yo creo que estamos funcionando, el logro no es más que funcionar como un pequeño grupo de presión que no se extraya al final del camino contra una pared, sino que tratamos de correr la barrera todos los días un poquitico más hacia adelante. Y por lo menos esa es mi misión, sea comunista, revolucionario, fidelista, lo que sea. Gracias.
All right. Given all the power I have in the organization of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, I'm going to make an executive decision to give our panel 30 minutes more because we started 30 minutes late and the juices are flowing. We have our final panelist here, and then we will have at each other respectfully, but I'm hoping with a lot of more light than heat. Ellery Biddle will now speak, give her piece, and then we will have our discussion.
Gracias a ustedes, es un placer enorme estar aquí con ustedes. Voy a presentar en inglés, pero quería. Okay, so hop right to it. I was asked to talk a little bit about what might be the future of the internet in Cuba when it comes to content, what you actually see and experience as an internet user. So I think that in a lot of what's been said here today, there's an idea that access is going to increase. So what changes will there be in internet regulation and how it's actually implemented, and how will Cubans navigate those changes? There are some regulations for the internet in Cuba now. There's some regulations that you can apply to the internet, but it hasn't been a super pressing issue because of the overall lack of access. And then the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is what kinds of changes this might imply for Cuban society. Something that we talk about a lot in the internet policy world is the idea that the internet serves as sort of a quasi-mirror of a country. Every country has policies for the internet, whether those exist as a creation of the government or companies that provide services or relationships with other countries. And those policies, like any other set of policies, are reflective of the interests of that government. And the internet, because of the way that it's built, as Oscar so nicely talked about, it's a decentralized creature. So there are parts of it that come to exist because of the way people use it. So what happens in the Cuban context? There has been a lot of talk about censorship because that is what people generally expect about the Cuban internet. I'm constantly, as a person who's spent a lot of time there and studied the internet there for a while, I'm constantly asked about technical censorship there. What kind of filtering, what kinds of websites can't you see? And interestingly enough, there isn't a whole lot of filtering in Cuba. In comparison to other countries that are frequently brought up in this context, China, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Cuba actually has relatively little filtering. But then the other thing, so I like this cartoon. This is by a Jordanian friend of mine, and it's nice because it notes all the different ways that you might experience or sort of exist in censorship. You might have censorship in your machine that's technical. You might have a government or some other kind of authority keeping you from seeing or reading something, or you might censor yourself. So those are all things to keep in mind as we talk about policy. So I wanted to look at China first because it's a kind of big factor on the table and important to look at when you think about internet in Cuba. About half of the country is online. There are many internet service providers, though they're subject to a lot of heavy state regulation. There is a robust market for all kinds of tech products and online services, and there's a whole lot of use and participation in these. As we all know, there is a lot of political censorship there, and that comes from a couple of things. One is a complex and unique infrastructure that is sort of casually referred to as the Great Firewall of China. There is also a tremendous amount of human resources put into technical censorship. There are at least 2 million people employed by the Chinese government to make comments online and to what they call channel public opinion. And there are also opinion analysts whose job it is to watch how conversations move in social media and report that to government and to the party. And then finally, there's plenty of police harassment and actual legal challenges experienced by journalists, human rights advocates, and anybody who might sort of show an indication of corruption or wrongdoing by the government. I thought this was interesting. One of the unique things about certain countries with a big internet industry is that they build their own versions of tools that we have here. And in a place like China, Weibo and WeChat are incredibly popular. And they're also based there. So as a Chinese internet user, you might be inclined to use these because your friends are there. It also works much better with the language, but it is also much more visible by Chinese authorities. Then we can move to the United States. So I don't need to go through much of this in detail. I'm pretty sure you all know these things. But we tend to think of the United States as we have a First Amendment. There is a great deal of media freedom and freedom of expression. However, there is a lot of regulation of the internet when it comes to copyright. When you see something censored, have you ever been on YouTube and you get to the little sad face and it says, oh, this is no longer available because it belongs to whatever company, or that's a big factor in the way that the internet works in the United States and in the kinds of trade relationships that we build with other countries. And Larry brought it up earlier today, and I bet that it will come up in the future with Cuba because of the vastly different approaches to IP that we have. My last example is kind of an odd one, but I thought it was interesting. These are 6 colleagues of mine in Ethiopia, all bloggers, all of whom were arrested about 16 months ago because of some politically critical blogging that they were doing. And their work was something that I started to follow when they started writing in English and working with Global Voices, which is my organization. And we have worked really hard to help them in this state. 3 of them are out, 3 of them are still in prison. And this kind of caused me to have to learn a lot about Ethiopia. And the more that I learned about the internet environment there, the more that I found myself thinking, kind of does remind me of Cuba, in that it is a very tiny elite population that actually uses the internet there to their full advantage right now. Also in that there is kind of a small niche market for unique hardware, for native hardware, and with a particular emphasis on language. Again, they don't use Latin characters, so there aren't other places where Amharic is used. So that is happening there. At the same time, there is heavy political censorship, both at the technical level and at the level of police harassment and legal challenges. And this is a picture from a hacker space and kind of tech incubator spot in Addis Ababa, and it's fun to see because it is interestingly a country where there's a tremendous amount of repression of political speech, but where development of tech tools for economic growth or for healthcare, other kinds of things, is perfectly okay. So there are a lot of different types of technical restrictions that you can encounter in the internet, depending on where you are. But there's usually a way around it. So I like this little Tony Auth cartoon with a little Twitter bird flying over the Great Firewall of China. And that's not how it actually works, but I'll spare you the technical explanation, but there are a lot of different types of tools that people use in the most restrictive countries in the world when it comes to internet to get around those restrictions. So that brings me to what's going to happen with Cuba. Well, I think that there will be more internet, and I think that there will be content restrictions, but people will also be able to get around them. And so that's something that I think that the state is perfectly well aware of and will kind of work with as they move along. So how am I doing on time?
You've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, great. So this question about a Cuban Spring has been brought up again and again. And it's something that journalists ask me a lot. And I think when I talk about this, I look to the example of Egypt. Here's Tahrir Square in 2011. So there was a very kind of salient, popular Western media narrative about the uprisings in the Arab world, that it was something powered by a hunger for democracy and by technology, particularly US-made technologies. And this photo made it around and around and around. There is a more complex story there, of course, and I think that also sort of has some useful parallels. One of them is that Egypt was incredibly economically depressed when this happened, and so there was a lot of general interest in the population in something changing. People were sick and tired of economic regulations and of not having what they needed. There were also networks of human rights activists who had been working together for over a decade, and these are two of them who were very prominent bloggers and tech developers who played really leading roles in organizing groups of people who started that movement. That's Alaa Abdel Fattah, and he actually has been in and out of prison in every single government that Egypt's had in the last 4 years, which is sort of a feather in his cap. So where does that leave Cuba? I think that it's like, I don't know, and I'm not here to tell anybody, but there are a couple of things to take away from what happens if everybody gets access to social media. You can spread a message and gather great numbers of people much more easily, quickly, and effectively with social media. On the other hand, it is much more difficult to maintain a message, to control it, and to know how much weight or power your movement actually has, because it's one thing to tweet or even to show up once. It's another thing to dedicate 10 years to a movement. And the other thing about social media is that it's really easy to surveil. So surveillance kind of permeates through all this. The more access that people have, the more that they speak online and interact online, the easier it is to watch. And that's true everywhere. That's not going to be unique to Cuba. We know it's perfectly true here. But that's a big factor. And I think in the documents that were leaked earlier this spring, national security is the top priority in the telecommunications agenda for the coming years, and that's a top priority for Cuba in general. But to me, that says surveillance and ability to control content and be able to anticipate what people are going to get around and what they're going to do when that happens. That's it.
All right, we got 15 minutes to talk, continue the conversation, and start new ones. So anybody who would like to make a comment, ask a question, start a line of conversation. Juan Tamayo.
Just a question for Carlos Alberto. ¿En español o en inglés?
As you wish.
En English.
It's about
So
the
what was your reaction
cyber
when you
wars,
printed
these
these
kind
laptops?
of controls.
I was just impressed. I mean, when I read some of that stuff, I thought, it's the first time that I've ever seen a Cuban publication publish something unofficial. In other words, it was a leak. And I thought, oh, he's going to jail. You know, he's gone. Apparently not. So what was your reaction?
When you ask your questions, try to say it louder. He just wanted to know the reaction when he did these leaks, and so that's fine.
Ah,
En español.
en español. A ver, uno siempre sabe en los líos que se mete, ¿no? Yo creo que en alguna medida en los 5 años he corrido mucha suerte. Es decir, cuando tienes, no sé, New York Times atrás de ti o algunos medios que ya te refieren, yo creo que evidentemente eso te cuida. Te puede perjudicar mucho, pero te cuida también. Y ya es más fácil meterse o es más fácil castigar a bloguerito nuevo, aquel que salió por allá por Morón, que ya meterte con alguien que en alguna medida tiene un reconocimiento y cuando grite pueden pasar cosas, ¿no? No obstante eso, yo creo que la clave es tener información valiosa, doble chequearla o triple chequearla con diferentes fuentes. Y ya si vas a decidir publicarla, saber, buscarte una, digamos, tener un background que te pueda proteger. Por ejemplo, esto de los leaks yo no lo publiqué en mi trabajo. Primer argumento del gobierno cubano: estás utilizando la internet estatal para hacer lo que no te toca. Pues yo cogí el periódico Gramma de ese día, me fui a los del presidente, pagué con mi cuenta, con mi dinero, y lo puse en Facebook, le estoy pagando a Telsa con su propia moneda, me hago un selfie para que no digan que la foto que yo tenía en el presidente fue de cuando fui a tomar café con algún amigo, y entonces publiqué la información de ahí. Primero, yo trabajo con mucha información buena, dura, y yo jamás en la vida como profesional y como ética publicaría esa información, nunca lo haré. La información me llegó por una vía externa, por ahí no me puedes coger. Y no me puedes coger tampoco por la parte de que lo estoy publicando en una institución oficial. Entonces, uno toma sus riesgos y pasa sus sustos y te llama a todo el mundo y te exprime todo el mundo y todo el mundo quiere saber tu fuente y en fin. Pero al final nada te pueden hacer. Y además, y al final si te hacen, porque sí pueden, pues entonces va el grito y detrás del grito viene mucha gente. También uno toca, uno es inteligente, uno toca. Cuando yo voy a publicar una bomba, yo toco. A mi gente que tiene mucho público, voy a soltar una bomba, voy a soltar una bomba, voy a soltar una bomba. Y la gente me dice, adelante. Que cualquier cosa que pase, es decir, uno también tiene que ser inteligente. No es que, ay, me cayó esto y lo publiqué. No. En Cuba no puedes hacer eso.
All right.
Total, te llamaron, te avisaron, te caucionaron, no sé cómo decirlo.
Mira, cuando el botoncito rojo, el foquito rojo de esa cámara que está ahí se apague, yo te hago ese cuento. Y allá afuera nos tomamos un café.
Por eso tenemos pasillos. Okay. Yes.
A cualquiera de ustedes. Yo sé que Texas es un monopolio, pero ¿quién es Texas dentro? ¿Qué es lo que es Texas por dentro? Es un monopolio obviamente económico hacia afuera y es un monopolio del Estado, pero ¿quiénes son los individuos que forman Texas? Porque en un momento había 3 o 4 compañías. Yo no entiendo.
Bueno, no me acuerdo cuándo fue esa última cuenta de 3 o 4 compañías. Creo que yo era muy chiquito. Primero éramos Ministerio de Comunicaciones. En el 91, siempre que hace un poquito de historia, lo dije ahorita, cuando los panamericanos la red telefónica estaba desbaratada, se hizo una compañía con capital extranjero, se hizo Intertel. Y ya después en el 96 es que se hace Texas. Desaparece Intertel, la parte de operaciones internacionales de Intertel pasa a Texas, se acabó. No ha habido más ninguna. ¿Quiénes la conforman? Obreros, trabajadores, los hay civiles, puede que algún militar retirado, puede que cualquiera, como lo hay en muchos lados. Son muchos. Muchas personas conforman esa compañía. Creo que es una de las cosas que más le pesa, que es muy grande, es un dinosaurio grande. Moverlo es complicado. Un monopolio no. En todas las provincias, en todos los municipios, en todos los lugares. Pero es así.
Let me just call out the people who will be next so we get them on the record. 1, 2, 3, okay? And then we'll come to 4 if we have time.
Buenas tardes. Muy buenas las presentaciones. Hay mercado de programadores que pueden trabajar de freelancer para el exterior.
Is there a market of programmers who can work freelance?
Seguro.
Anybody who wants to answer, go for it.
I have to say it in English. Yeah, that's a real, I think also it'd be interesting to hear what Arch has to say. There are, the list of self-employment eligible occupations, it's pretty hokey. It's like clowns and all kinds of weird things. But computer programmer is one of the occupations that is on that list. And there are a lot of, and also the United States is, at least the current administration, has said they will indemnify people who purchase things in Cuba from independent sellers. So it seems to me that that opens up the possibility for legally and above board Cuban programmers doing development in the United States, or obviously for other nations as well. And historically there's a lot of people doing it under the table, but it seems now that it's open as a possibility above the table. And there are all kinds of advantages. Cuba is close. Cuba is in our eastern time zone, well educated. So it seems to me like a real natural thing to happen. And I'd also be curious, Arch was talking before about cooperatives. Have there been any applications to form software development cooperatives? And I have no idea.
I wouldn't be surprised also if the price point would be a very attractive one. And,
really.
and also for Miami, I think that the cultural and linguistic links could make, outsourcing various, things that you could do. Mimi has written a little bit about this when the law was changed back in February about kinds of services that Cubans could provide, and one of those could be in terms of programming and other things like that. Pascal?
Si no me equivoco, la pregunta del colega era sobre los accionistas de Texas. O sea que, haciendo un poco de historia, empezaron con los mexicanos, estaban también los italianos, después se vendió. Ahora no sé, está el Ministerio de Comunicaciones, está esa entidad amorosa, financiera, militar, o sea que no sé si tiene algunos detalles sobre los actuales accionistas. ¿Quiénes son?
Eso mismo.
Eso mismo, Ministerio de Comunicaciones y Rafin y no sé.
Pero lo que pasa es que nosotros vemos una estructura totalmente monopolística aquí y estamos acostumbrados a saber quiénes son los que están dentro del monopolio, y entonces pues nos confundimos porque obviamente, como dice el colega, se supo que empezó en México, pero mira dónde ha llegado, y están proveyendo un servicio muy pobre a la población, porque yo recibo información de mi familia que es extremadamente pobre el servicio y no quieren enseñar a nadie, sino vender lo que tienen. Es terrible, un monopolio terrible.
Why don't we go to the question that in the back?
Okay. My question is about funding. If Cuba is going to expand its internet network, assuming the government doesn't have the capital to pay for it, what incentive do foreign telecoms companies such as AT&T have from investing significantly in Cuba, taking into account the average salary of Cuban citizens?
Good, excellent question. So what about the economics of investing in Cuba and telecom, given the poverty of the Cuban government and the poverty of the Cuban population?
I think I don't obviously represent AT&T or Comcast or any of those people, and I consider them evil monopolies just as I consider a Texan an evil monopoly. But no, I think your question's right. It's a small market. It's an impoverished market. There's no domestic infrastructure. They would have to do some kind of a deal where they got a license in return for investing and building the infrastructure. I think that starts to sound a lot to me like what Arch was calling Walmartizations or McDonaldization, I don't recall which. And so if I were in Cuba, I wouldn't be in any hurry to have foreign investors come in. I would, like I was saying in my talk, I would kind of do what you can in the short run, really plan for the long run when perhaps you do have money to invest in, to build your own, to be somewhat independent and build your own infrastructure.
I would just answer that by saying that many of them are probably looking at it in part from a symbolic foot in the door PR thing in the beginning, but then positioning themselves because that market has a lot of growth potential and there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. And so they could be investing now at a loss based on the expectation that salaries will grow, the economy will pick up, and they will be well positioned for a future when they can cash in. So that might be the strategy, but that's just speculation.
Let me add a footnote to that. One company that's been here now 3 times and it gets talked about, though I think with a lot of misconceptions, is Google. And they have an incentive to see have Cuban users without getting a return on the, without having them pay a fee, because they make money off of the advertising. And so I think Google is a possible vendor or installer of infrastructure. And I know there was this, about 2 weeks, well, you read the quote where they're saying, oh, Google offered free connectivity to all of Cuba and the Cubans turned it down. Nobody really knows what, I've talked to Google a lot. They won't tell me what they really offered. So it's not clear to me that anybody knows that. Also, that quote doesn't mention Google at all. It just says, we don't trust the United States. And the truth is, they don't trust Google. The guy that's head of Google Ideas, that is the organization that has been coming here, he's an ex-State Department guy. And so there is a lot of mistrust. But Google may be give it a couple of years, Google may have
have traditionally very low Cuban readership given the very low access rates. Some of them are trying to get and have gotten onto the packet, but my experience or my understanding from looking at the packet is 98% entertainment and 2%, hard information, hard news, politics, and that kind of stuff. When I talked with La Joven Cuba a number of years ago in Cuba, and they've published on their website that their readership was largely, maybe 95% back then, outside the country. So it's a challenge for all of them. However, it's hard to know because in Cuba, people get information through various means and back doors and flash drives. Maybe Carlos Alberto could speak more to that. A few months, ads started appearing on the site, and they're targeted ads to a Cuban audience or Cuban American audience. There's also On Cuba, which is unapologetically a business enterprise. And Hugo Cancio, there's a great article in the New Yorker, the most recent New Yorker by John Lee Anderson, that tries to find out a little bit about that business enterprise. And Hugo Cancio has a long history of launching various enterprises, entertainment, and now in the media area. And he's launching new magazines. But it's still unclear, at least as far as I could tell, how much traction, how much income, revenue that they've made, and how much of it is speculative for a future when there will be space legal for them to exist. Anybody else wanted to comment on that?
Throw something in. I'll throw in that I think actually voice and audience is very evident in any piece of writing you read anywhere, but in the blogosphere especially, a blogger tends to have a desired set of readers, and you can tell, Cuban blogs included, there are people who really are writing for an audience on the outside, and there are people who actually, I think, put in a lot of work to get their materials around locally. I know Elaine, who's working on this Periodismo de Barrio project, she wants to figure out a way to get it into the packet or to work out some kind of deal so that it can circulate there. But I totally agree that the packet is mostly entertainment, and if it became, if more political or critical content got in there, I don't know if it could, but if it did, that might jeopardize the packets.
Carlos Alberto, ¿qué sabes tú de tu público, audiencia? And that's the last question, so we'll make it brief, the answer, okay?
Bueno, es un poco complicado, porque nunca sabremos en las estadísticas de mi blog. Salen muchos visitantes, pero de Cuba es muy difícil, disculpen por el cámara. Desde Cuba es muy difícil saber, porque existe algo que se llama NAP, que contabiliza todas las direcciones IP, desde una cosa que se llama NAP, que está en Camagüey. Entonces, me han explicado que es muy difícil contabilizar, que a veces te pueden estar entrando 10 lectores y lo contabiliza como un solo IP. Entonces, las estadísticas no son tan reales. Esa es una. La otra es que en mi caso, por ejemplo, yo recibo muchas solicitudes por correo electrónico de gente que quiere suscribirse porque ya no tiene internet, porque estuvo en un trabajo que tenía internet y ahora no lo tiene, y porque lo que tiene es correo electrónico. Cuando he publicado alguna de esas cositas interesantes que se suelen publicar, a veces a mí mismo me han llegado, o a mi esposa le han llegado 4 y 5 veces el correo. Significa, es decir, el post que llegó por correo y que empezó a hacer forward por diferentes usuarios. Entonces es muy complicado. Una anécdota muy sencilla. Una vez un amigo mío iba caminando por San Miguel del Padrón, 10 de la noche, jugando dominó, los guaposos en la esquina, y estaba hablando, oye, eso salió en la chiringa, le dijo uno al otro. Y entonces eso lo escuchó un amigo mío, enseguida me llamó emocionado. Es decir, los guaposos del barrio que estaban jugando dominó, estaban hablando algo que salió en la chiringa y que su esposo se lo había impreso en un papel. Entonces es muy complicado contabilizar, pero sí existe. Además, muchos medios también, cuando uno publica una cosa, lo que hacen es te republican, tanto medios nacionales, blogueros, en fin. Bueno, ya no tanto medios nacionales. Pero bueno.
All right, I want to thank the public, and I especially want to thank the panel. Thank you very much for this excellent reflection. A round of applause. The business meeting for